That crisp autumn night, I was sitting at my familiar kitchen table, a pen clutched in my hand, meticulously reviewing the stack of papers spread before me. My Medicare statements were on top, followed by the pre-op instructions the doctor's office had mailed. My hip replacement surgery was scheduled for early December, a date I had waited nearly a year to secure. Insurance would cover a good portion, thankfully, but the remaining $8,000 out-of-pocket expense had been sitting safely in a dedicated savings account I'd opened specifically for this. It was my lifeline to regaining my mobility, my promise to myself for a more comfortable future. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. Then the phone rang, shattering the quiet concentration. It was my son, Brad. "Hey, Mom, what's up?" His voice sounded upbeat, maybe a touch too breezy for a weeknight call. "Oh, hi, honey," I replied, a small smile touching my lips. "Just going over some medical paperwork, getting everything in order for the surgery." "That's good, Mom. Glad to hear it," Brad said. "Listen, Lauren and I have some exciting news we wanted to share with you." A little flutter of anticipation rose within me. "Oh? What is it?" "Well," Brad began, a note of almost forced enthusiasm in his tone. "Lauren's parents have always talked about wanting to see Hawaii, you know? It's been their dream trip." I nodded slowly, picturing the sunny beaches and turquoise waters. "Yes, I think I remember them mentioning that a while back." "So," Brad continued, "we decided to surprise them. We booked a trip for all of us next month. Just a week to relax and soak up the sun." A sudden chill ran through me, despite the warmth of the kitchen. "Hawaii," I repeated, trying to keep my voice even. "That's quite a trip." "Yeah, we went all out," Brad said casually. "Flights, a really nice resort, one of those all-inclusive deals, snorkeling, luau's, the whole 9 yards. Lauren's parents are going to be so thrilled. They've never been anywhere like that before, and we really wanted to do something special for them. You know?" I couldn't speak immediately. A tightness constricted my throat, a knot of apprehension forming in my stomach. Something felt off. "That's very generous of you both, Brad," I finally managed to say, the words feeling heavy and uncertain on my tongue. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, a silence that stretched just a little too long. Then Brad spoke again, his tone shifting, becoming a little too nonchalant. "Yeah, well, you know how it is, Mom. Things have been a little tight lately, so we actually used some of the money from your surgery fund to book the initial costs." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My pen slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the table. The carefully printed numbers on my Medicare statement blurred before my eyes. My surgery fund, the nest egg I had so diligently built, the symbol of my hope for a pain-free future, the money I had sacrificed so much for. You used my surgery money, Brad." My voice was barely a whisper, laced with disbelief and a dawning sense of betrayal. "Now, Mom, don't get upset," Brad said quickly, his tone placating. "It's just temporary. We promise we'll pay it back. Once Lauren gets her bonus, or maybe when our tax refund comes in, it'll all work out, you'll see." But his reassurances did little to soothe the icy dread that was now spreading through me. My carefully planned future felt suddenly precarious, my security shattered by a single, thoughtless decision. The image of those sunny Hawaiian beaches now felt like a cruel mockery of my own looming pain and uncertainty. "Brad," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "you know how important that money is to me. That's for my health, for me to be able to walk without pain again." His reply was quick, dismissive. "I know, Mom, I know, but it was a really good deal, and Lauren's parents, they really deserve this. We just needed a little help to make it happen right now. You always understand, Mom. You're always so generous." His words, meant to comfort, felt like a sharp twist of a knife. Generous? He had taken my security, my hope for healing, and labeled it as something I would willingly give away. The weight of his words, and the implication behind them, settled heavily in the silence that followed. The conversation had just begun, but in that moment, sitting at my kitchen table, under the soft glow of the overhead light, I knew things would never quite be the same. The silence on my end of the phone line must have been deafening. I could hear Brad shuffling on his end, a nervous cough breaking the stillness. My mind was racing, trying to catch up with the casual cruelty of his words. My surgery fund, gone. Used for a vacation for his in-laws, people I barely knew. The audacity of it stole my breath. "Brad," I finally choked out, my voice thin and shaky. "Are you serious? That money, that's for my hip. You know I need that surgery." "Mom, please just hear me out," he pleaded, his tone now laced with a hint of defensiveness. "It was a really good deal, and we had to book it quickly to get the price. Lauren's parents were so excited, and we thought you wouldn't mind helping out this once. You always do." That phrase hung in the air, heavy with a history I suddenly saw in a harsh new light. You always do. It wasn't a statement of love or appreciation. It was an expectation, a reliance that had become a silent burden I had unknowingly carried for years. My mind flashed back to countless instances. Brad in college, needing money for books, which somehow morphed into spring break expenses. Brad and Lauren's first apartment, the temporary loan for the security deposit that was never fully repaid. The time their car broke down, and I shelled out for the repairs, delaying my own much-needed dental work. Each time, I had given willingly, out of love for my son and a desire to help him get on his feet. But it had become a pattern, a subtle erosion of my own financial security, masked by their easy assurances of repayment that rarely materialized. Lauren, especially, had a knack for making requests sound like necessities. A new outfit for a wedding, a contribution to a once-in-a-lifetime vacation, the latest gadget for their home. Brad, caught between his wife and his mother, often took the path of least resistance, relaying their needs with a hopeful, almost childlike expectation that Mom would come through. And I usually did, because what else could a mother do? Now this felt different. This wasn't a small loan or a helping hand. This was the core of my independence, my path to healing, casually swept away for someone else's pleasure. The knot in my chest tightened, a cold dread settling in its place. "Helping out, Brad," I repeated, the bitterness creeping into my voice. "This isn't helping out with groceries or a small bill. This is my medical care we're talking about, my ability to walk without pain." "How could you possibly think that was okay?" he stammered, trying to explain, to minimize the impact of his actions. He talked about how happy it made Lauren's parents, how much it meant to Lauren, how they would absolutely, definitely pay me back as soon as they could. But his words sounded hollow, flimsy excuses against the stark reality of what he had done. The betrayal stung, not just the financial aspect, but the blatant disregard for my well-being. The assumption that my needs were somehow less important than their desires. It felt like a profound lack of respect, a deep wound to the trust I had placed in my son. I needed to talk to someone who would understand without judgment. My best friend, Nora, had been my rock through thick and thin, a steady presence since our college days. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling slightly as I scrolled through my contacts. Nora answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Angela, is everything all right? You sound off." Taking a deep breath, I recounted Brad's call, the casual announcement, the devastating revelation. As I spoke, the dam of my composure began to crack, and the raw emotion poured out. The shock, the hurt, the anger, the dawning realization of a pattern I had allowed to continue for too long. Nora listened patiently, her usual cheerful tone replaced with a quiet understanding. When I finally finished, the silence on her end was thoughtful, heavy with the weight of my words. "Oh, Angela," she said softly, her voice filled with sympathy. I don't even know what to say. That's just not right." "Not right?" I echoed, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. Nora, he took my surgery money, my future, and he acted like it was nothing, like I'm just a bottomless well of funds they can dip into whenever they please. I know, honey, I know, Nora soothed. This is a lot to process. What are you going to do? The question hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. I didn't have an answer. All I felt was a swirling vortex of confusion, hurt, and a growing sense that something had to change. The easygoing relationship I had with my son, the quiet acceptance of their financial needs, it had led to this. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't let it continue. My grandson, Finn, was a bright spot in my life, a little ray of sunshine who could always bring a smile to my face. At 5 years old, he was full of boundless energy and endless questions, his curiosity a constant whirlwind around my quiet home. Brad and Lauren often brought him over, especially on weekends, citing their busy schedules or the need for a date night. I cherished those times with Finn. We'd read stories, build elaborate Lego castles, and bake lopsided cookies that tasted suspiciously of too much sugar. His small hand in mine felt like a tangible connection to the past and a hopeful link to the future. But as my hip pain worsened, caring for Finn became increasingly difficult. Chasing after his quicksilver movements left me breathless and aching. Lifting him for a hug, once a natural gesture of affection, now sent sharp jolts of pain through my hip. Even simple tasks, like bending down to tie his shoes or helping him climb onto the sofa, required careful planning and often left me hobbling for hours afterward. I rarely complained. I loved Finn fiercely, and the thought of not being able to care for him filled me with a quiet sadness. Brad and Lauren, however, seemed largely oblivious to the physical toll it took on me. They dropped Finn off with a quick kiss and a list of instructions, their minds already elsewhere. There were no offers to pick him up early, no inquiries about how my hip was feeling. It was simply assumed that Grandma would handle it, that my time and energy were freely available. Lauren, in particular, had a way of making me feel more like a convenient babysitting service than a cherished grandmother. Her instructions regarding Finn were often detailed and demanding, ranging from specific organic snacks to rigid nap schedules. She would critique my parenting choices, often subtly, sometimes not so subtly, comparing my old-fashioned ways to the latest parenting trends she read online. "Mom, you really shouldn't let him watch so much television," she'd say, her tone implying I was somehow harming her child. Or, "Are you sure he's eating enough vegetables?" Dr. Peterson says. The criticisms, though often veiled as concern, chipped away at my confidence and made me feel inadequate in my own home. Brad, caught in the middle, usually remained silent. He would nod along to Lauren's directives, offering a weak smile in my direction, but rarely interjected or acknowledged the effort I was putting in. It was as if he was afraid to disagree with Lauren, or perhaps he simply didn't see the imbalance in our arrangement. He seemed to take my help for granted, just as he had taken my surgery fund. There were times when the pain was so intense that I had to excuse myself, retreating to my bedroom for a few precious moments of rest while Finn played independently. Guilt would gnaw at me. Guilt for not being able to be the energetic grandmother Finn deserved. Guilt for needing to prioritize my own failing body. But the silence from Brad and Lauren, the lack of acknowledgement or offer of support, only amplified the feeling that my needs were secondary to their convenience. The weight of their expectations, coupled with the increasing pain in my hip, had become a heavy burden. I loved my son and my grandson, but the constant giving, the unspoken demands, and the lack of consideration were starting to take their toll. The incident with the surgery fund had brought a simmering resentment to a boil, forcing me to confront the imbalance in our relationship that I had long tried to ignore. The role of doting grandmother had, over time, morphed into something that felt more like unpaid labor, a silent obligation that was now jeopardizing my own health and well-being. And the casual way my son had disregarded my future for the sake of his in-laws' vacation was a stark reminder of just how little my own needs seemed to matter in their world. Looking back, The signs had been there for a long time. Little red flags I had either ignored or rationalized away out of love for my son. Brad and Lauren lived in a lovely house, bigger than they probably needed, in a newer development on the edge of town. They had 2 relatively new cars, and Lauren always seemed to have the latest fashions and gadgets. Their lifestyle, from the outside, looked comfortable, even affluent. But beneath the surface, I knew things weren't always smooth sailing financially. There were hints dropped in conversations, anxieties masked by forced smiles. They talked about credit card bills and the pressure of keeping up with their neighbors. Lauren often mentioned sales and must-have items, and Brad would sometimes allude to work being slow or unexpected expenses cropping up. Over the years, these little financial ripples had often led to requests for help, always framed as temporary measures or small favors. It started subtly, a request for a few $100s to cover a temporary shortfall until payday. Then it was a larger sum for car repairs, promising immediate repayment that somehow never quite materialized. There was the time they needed help with a down payment for a new refrigerator, their old one having unexpectedly died, and the countless smaller amounts for Finn's extracurricular activities, for birthday gifts, for just a little extra to get them through the month. Each time I had helped, sometimes willingly, sometimes with a silent sigh, as I dipped into my own carefully managed savings. I told myself it was family, that parents helped their children. I wanted to see Brad and Lauren happy, and I adored Finn. But looking back, I saw a pattern emerging. A subtle but persistent reliance on my financial support that had become an unspoken expectation. The unspoken resentment had been growing within me like a slow-burning ember. I felt a quiet frustration at their lack of financial responsibility, their tendency to live beyond their means while seemingly expecting me to be their safety net. It wasn't the money itself, not entirely. It was the feeling of being taken for granted, the lack of acknowledgement for my own careful budgeting, and the sacrifices I made to help them. I often wondered if they truly understood the value of $1, the effort it took to save. But I kept my feelings to myself. I didn't want to cause conflict, didn't want to be seen as the unsupportive mother or the stingy grandmother. I cherished my relationship with Brad, and the thought of jeopardizing it with criticism or complaints kept me silent. So the resentment simmered, a bitter undercurrent beneath the surface of our interactions. Then came my follow-up appointment with Dr. Evans, the orthopedic surgeon. He reviewed my latest x-rays, his expression becoming more serious as he spoke. He explained that the deterioration in my hip had progressed, and delaying the surgery any further could lead to more complications and a longer recovery. He emphasized the importance of getting it done within the next couple of months to ensure the best possible outcome. His words hit me hard. This wasn't just about pain management anymore. It was about my long-term health and mobility. The surgery wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity, and the realization that my son had so casually jeopardized my access to that crucial medical care sent a jolt of anger through me, hotter and more intense than the simmering resentment I had been harboring. Dr. Evans's warning was a turning point. It forced me to confront the reality of my situation and the consequences of Brad's actions. My health, my independence, my future. These were not things to be sacrificed for a vacation, no matter how much pleasure it might bring to others. The time for quiet acceptance was over. The boiling point had been reached. The comfortable silence I had maintained for so long was about to be broken. Sleep evaded me that night. The digital clock on my nightstand blinked mockingly in the darkness, each passing minute amplifying the turmoil in my mind. One moment, anger surged, a hot wave of resentment at Brad's selfishness and Lauren's entitlement. The next, a familiar pang of guilt would hit me. He was my son after all. How could I even consider doing something that would undoubtedly cause him and his family such distress? I tossed and turned, the worn cotton sheets twisting around me like the conflicting thoughts in my head. My love for Brad was a deep-seated instinct, a bond that had been forged over decades. I remembered the joy of holding him as a baby, the pride I felt at his milestones, the countless times I had offered comfort and support throughout his life. Could I really take an action that would so clearly hurt him? But then the image of Dr. Evans's serious face flashed in my mind, his words echoing in the silence of my bedroom. Delaying the surgery any further could lead to more complications. My health, my ability to live independently, to continue volunteering at the library, to even play with Finn without constant pain. All of that was tied to that surgery. And Brad had so casually put it all at risk. The weight of their financial dependence on me pressed down. A familiar ache in my heart. Had my constant willingness to help inadvertently enabled their irresponsibility? Had my fear of confrontation allowed this pattern to continue for too long? The thought was unsettling, a bitter pill to swallow. The next morning, the exhaustion etched on my face was impossible to ignore. My older brother, Frank, called, sensing something was wrong. Frank had always been my steadfast supporter, a voice of reason in my life. I confided in him, the words tumbling out in a rush of frustration and hurt. Frank listened patiently, his usual jovial tone replaced with a quiet understanding. When I finally finished, there was a long pause before he spoke. "Angela," he said gently, "you've always had such a big heart. You've given so much to Brad and his family. But honey, there comes a time when you have to put yourself first. Your health, your well-being. That has to be your priority now." His words were like a balm to my troubled soul. He didn't dismiss my love for Brad, but he validated my feelings of being taken advantage of. He reminded me of my own strength and resilience, of the life I had built for myself after Robert passed. "What are you thinking of doing?" Frank asked, his voice calm and supportive. The idea had been forming in the back of my mind, a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. It felt drastic, even a little vengeful, but the thought of those precious surgery funds being used for a frivolous vacation while my pain worsened fueled my resolve. I'm thinking of freezing the credit card Brad used to book the trip," I confessed, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. There was a moment of silence on Frank's end. Then he said simply, "Angela, you have every right to protect yourself. That money is yours, for your health. If that's what you feel you need to do, I'll support you." His unwavering support solidified my decision. It wasn't about punishing Brad or Lauren. It was about self-preservation. It was about drawing a line, finally, and saying, "Enough." The next step was to figure out the logistics. I didn't want to be home when the fallout occurred. I knew Brad and Lauren's reaction would be explosive, and I needed time and space to process everything. "Frank," I said, an idea forming, "remember Robert's old cabin up in the mountains? The one we haven't visited in ages?" "Of course," Frank replied. "The one near Estes Park?" "Yes," I said. "What if we went up there for a few days? Just a short trip, starting the day they're supposed to leave for Hawaii." Frank understood immediately. "A strategic retreat," he said with a wry smile. "I like it. Let me handle the arrangements. We can pack up and head out early that morning." A sense of calm, a fragile sense of control, began to settle over me. The decision was made. The plan was in motion. It was a difficult choice, one that came with a heavy heart and a knot of apprehension about the future. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was taking back some of the power that had been so carelessly taken from me. The road ahead would undoubtedly be rocky, but I knew, with Frank by my side, I wouldn't have to face it alone. The morning of their scheduled departure for Hawaii dawned gray and still. Frank arrived before sunrise, his familiar pickup truck rumbling softly in my driveway. We moved quickly and quietly, loading my suitcase and a few essentials into the back. There was a strange sense of finality in closing the front door, a silent farewell to the life I had known, at least for the immediate future. We left no note, no explanation. I couldn't bring myself to write anything. The words feeling inadequate and likely to ignite a firestorm of accusations before we were even gone. Let them discover it at the airport, I thought grimly. Let them face the consequences of their actions when it was too late to do anything about it. The drive to the cabin was quiet. Frank, ever the perceptive one, didn't press me to talk. He simply put on some gentle folk music and let me gather my thoughts. The scenery outside the window, the rolling hills giving way to the majestic peaks of the Rockies, provided a soothing backdrop to the turmoil within me. Meanwhile, miles away, the scene at the airport was likely unfolding, in stark contrast to our peaceful journey. I imagined Brad and Lauren, their excitement building as they checked in for their flight. Lauren's parents beaming with anticipation. Then, the moment of truth at the gate, the swipe of the credit card, the dreaded decline message flashing on the screen. I could picture Brad's initial confusion, quickly turning to annoyance, then dawning horror as he realized what had happened. Lauren's reaction would likely be louder, more accusatory. Blame would be assigned, phones would be frantically dialed, and my quiet morning would soon be shattered by their outrage. As Frank and I finally reached the cabin, nestled deep in a pine forest, a sense of relief washed over me, mingled with a heavy dose of guilt and sadness. The cabin held so many memories of Robert, of happier times. His presence seemed to linger in the scent of the wood smoke and the comfortable silence of the mountains. It was a sanctuary, a place to escape the noise and the demands of my everyday life. But even in this peaceful setting, the thought of Brad's anger and Lauren's fury cast a shadow. I knew their calls would come, their messages would flood my phone. I had turned off the ringer, but the anticipation of their reaction was a knot in my stomach. And then there was Finn, my sweet, innocent grandson. The thought of him at the airport, confused and disappointed when his grandparents' dream trip suddenly evaporated, tugged at my heartstrings. He wouldn't understand the financial complexities or the betrayal that had led to this. All he would know was that the promised adventure wasn't happening. I pictured his small, crestfallen face, his innocent questions about when they would go to the beach and see the colorful fish. He would miss his parents, and he would likely miss me too, unaware of the silent battle that had led to my absence. The collateral damage of Brad and Lauren's actions extended beyond just their vacation plans. It touched the innocent heart of a child. That first day at the cabin was a strange mix of serenity and anxiety. The beauty of the natural surroundings offered a sense of calm, but the underlying tension of the impending confrontation kept me on edge. I knew I had done what I needed to do to protect myself, but the emotional cost was undeniable. The silence of the mountains was a welcome change from the demands of my life in Denver, but it also amplified the quiet ache of a family, fractured by selfishness, and a mother's difficult decision. The days at the cabin unfolded with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a stark contrast to the hurried pace of my life back in Denver. Surrounded by towering pines and the crisp mountain air, a sense of peace began to seep into my weary soul. The silence was profound, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. It was a silence that allowed my own thoughts to finally surface, uncluttered by the demands and expectations of others. I spent my mornings sitting on the porch, a warm mug of tea in my hands, gazing at the breathtaking vista of the mountains. The sheer scale and majesty of nature had a humbling effect, putting my own troubles into perspective. The pain in my hip was still there, a constant reminder of my physical limitations, but the emotional ache began to subside, replaced by a quiet sense of resilience. Frank was a steady and comforting presence. He didn't offer unsolicited advice, but he was always there to listen, his gentle questions prompting me to explore my feelings without judgment. We took short, easy walks along the forest trails, the crunch of pine needles underfoot a grounding sensation. In the evenings, we would sit by the crackling fireplace, sharing stories and comfortable silences. He reminded me of passions I had let fade over the years, my love for painting, my enjoyment of reading classic literature. He had even packed a set of watercolors and some art paper, encouraging me to capture the beauty around me. Slowly, tentatively, I began to reconnect with these parts of myself, the creative spirit that had been dormant for too long. One afternoon, my phone, which I had finally turned back on but kept on silent, buzzed with a message. It was from Carol, an old friend from my book club, someone I hadn't spoken to in months. She had heard through the grapevine that I was dealing with some family issues and wanted to check in. Her simple message of support, "Thinking of you, Angela. Let's get coffee when you're back," brought tears to my eyes. It was a reminder that my life extended beyond my role as a mother and grandmother, that there were people who valued me for who I was, not just for what I could do for them. Other friends reached out too, their messages offering comfort and solidarity. It was a gentle reminder that I wasn't alone, that there was a network of support waiting for me back in Denver. These connections, rekindled by my absence, served as a powerful antidote to the feeling of isolation that Brad and Lauren's actions had inadvertently created. As the days at the cabin passed, a shift in my perspective began to take hold. I started to see the dynamics with Brad and Lauren more clearly, recognizing the unhealthy patterns of entitlement and dependence that had taken root over the years. I realized that my fear of jeopardizing the relationship had actually allowed it to become unbalanced, with their needs consistently taking precedence over my own. I began to understand that setting boundaries wasn't an act of aggression or a withdrawal of love. It was an act of self-respect, a necessary step in reclaiming my own agency. Protecting my financial security and my health wasn't selfish. It was essential for my own well-being and, ultimately, for any healthy relationship I hope to have with my son in the future. The tranquility of the mountains provided a space for introspection and healing. Away from the constant demands and subtle manipulations, I could finally hear my own inner voice, the voice that had been telling me for a long time that things needed to change. The anger began to soften, replaced by a quiet determination. I would return to Denver a different woman, one who valued her own needs and was no longer willing to sacrifice her well-being for the sake of others' unchecked desires. The process of reclaiming myself had begun, nurtured by the quiet wisdom of the mountains and the unwavering support of my brother and friends. The fragile peace of the cabin was shattered on the third day by the insistent ringing of my cell phone. I glanced at the caller ID, Brad. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the inevitable storm. Frank gave me a nod of support from across the room. "Hello, Brad," I said, my voice calm and measured, a stark contrast to the anxiety churning within me. The barrage began immediately. His voice was a mixture of anger and disbelief, accusing me of being cruel, vindictive, and selfish. How could I do this to them? Ruin their long-awaited vacation? Embarrass Lauren's parents at the airport? Didn't I care about my own family? I listened without interrupting, letting him vent his fury. When he finally paused for breath, I spoke, my voice firm but devoid of emotion. "Brad, I understand you're upset, but I made a decision to protect my own health and financial security. That money was specifically for my surgery, a surgery I desperately need. Using it for a vacation without my permission was not acceptable." His tone shifted, becoming more pleading. He talked about how much the trip meant to Lauren's parents, how disappointed everyone was. He promised, again, that they would pay me back as soon as they could. "Brad," I said, my voice unwavering, "this isn't the first time there have been promises of repayment that haven't materialized. I need that money for my surgery, and I can't afford to wait indefinitely. The credit card will remain frozen." Then Lauren got on the phone, her voice shrill with indignation. She accused me of trying to sabotage their lives, of being a terrible mother and grandmother. She played the victim, talking about how stressed and upset she was, how unfair this was to her parents. "Angela," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "think about Finn. He was so excited about us going to Hawaii. Now he's going to be so disappointed. Is that what you want? To upset your own grandson?" It was a classic guilt trip, a tactic they had used many times before. But something had shifted within me during my time at the cabin. Their emotional manipulation no longer held the same power. "Lauren," I replied calmly, "Finn's disappointment is a consequence of your and Brad's actions, not mine. You made a decision to use money that wasn't yours, knowing its intended purpose. You need to take responsibility for that." Their calls and messages continued over the next few days, escalating in their demands and accusations. They tried every tactic they could think of: anger, tears, guilt trips, even veiled threats about limiting my access to Finn. But each time, I held firm, repeating my boundaries with a quiet resolve. Frank was a steadfast support throughout this barrage, reminding me of my strength and the validity of my decision. He fielded some of their calls when I needed a break, his calm demeanor often deflating their anger. What became increasingly clear during these exchanges was Brad's continued passivity. While Lauren raged and demanded, Brad often remained silent or offered weak, half-hearted arguments. He seemed unable or unwilling to stand up to Lauren or to truly acknowledge the gravity of their actions. It reinforced the pattern I had observed for years: Brad allowing Lauren to dictate their financial decisions and then expecting me to clean up the mess. Their inability to take responsibility for their choices was glaring. They painted themselves as victims of my cruelty rather than acknowledging the consequences of their own entitlement. It was a stark reminder of the unhealthy dynamic that had plagued our relationship for so long. By the end of the week, their calls became less frequent, their anger seemingly having run its course, at least for the moment. The silence that returned was different this time. It wasn't the comfortable silence of the mountains, but a strained, uneasy quiet, heavy with unspoken resentment and the undeniable shift in our family dynamic. I knew things would never be the same. The confrontation had been painful, but it had also been necessary. The boundaries had been set, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of clarity and a fragile hope for a future where my own needs were finally acknowledged. Upon returning to my quiet Denver home, the silence felt different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the mountains, nor the strained quiet of the aftermath of the phone calls. It was a quiet of my own making, a space I had intentionally created for myself. The echoes of Brad and Lauren's anger still lingered, but they were fading, replaced by a growing sense of inner strength. Legally, Brad's actions were a gray area. The money was in my account, but as my son, there was a level of implied trust and access he had often taken advantage of. Pursuing legal action felt like a drastic step, one that would likely cause irreparable damage to our already strained relationship. For now, I decided against it, focusing instead on securing my immediate future. My health. The first thing I did was reschedule my hip replacement surgery. The appointment was set for the new year, giving me time to mentally and physically prepare. I also took steps to ensure my financial security was no longer vulnerable. I opened a new savings account, separate from any joint accounts I had shared with Brad in the past, and put safeguards in place to prevent unauthorized access. My focus shifted entirely to my own well-being. I started attending gentle yoga classes to strengthen my body and ease the pain in my hip. I reconnected with my friends from the library and the book club, finding comfort and support in their companionship. I even picked up my watercolors again, finding joy in capturing the vibrant colors of the Colorado sunsets. Life wasn't perfect. The rift with Brad and Lauren remained, a constant undercurrent of sadness. There were days when I missed Finn terribly, his infectious laughter and warm hugs leaving a void in my home. Brad would occasionally send a text message, usually a brief inquiry about my health or a picture of Finn, but the underlying tension was always there. I held on to a sliver of hope that, in time, Brad might truly understand the impact of his actions and take responsibility for them. Perhaps, with maturity and a greater sense of financial accountability, reconciliation might be possible. But I knew that any future relationship would need to be built on a foundation of mutual respect and clear boundaries. I would no longer be the default safety net, the ever-willing source of funds to bail them out of their financial missteps. As the weeks turned into months, I began to embrace this new chapter in my life. I found a quiet strength in my independence and a renewed sense of purpose in prioritizing my own needs. The pain in my hip was a constant reminder of the journey I was on, a journey towards healing and self-preservation. I looked forward to the surgery with a sense of anticipation, not just for the relief from pain, but for the freedom to fully participate in the life I was reclaiming. The future held uncertainties, but for the first time in a long time, I faced it with a sense of hope and resilience. I had learned a valuable lesson about the importance of setting boundaries and the necessity of putting my own well-being first. It had been a painful lesson, but one that had ultimately led me to a stronger, more self-assured version of myself. And now, as our story comes to a close, I want to ask you, my viewers, to take a moment to reflect on your own lives. Have you ever struggled with setting boundaries with family, even when it was difficult? How do you find the balance between loving and supporting your loved ones and ensuring you honor your own needs and self-respect in your relationships? What does it truly mean to put yourself first, and how can you embrace that in your own life journey? Your thoughts and experiences are valuable, and I encourage you to share them in the comments below. Let's create a community of support and understanding. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and share it with others who might find comfort or inspiration in Angela's journey. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel for more stories of resilience, empowerment, and the strength of the human spirit. Thank you for listening.